He had always dreamed of living somewhere peaceful, away from the noise and rush of the city. After years of working long hours, saving every extra penny and skipping vacations, he finally found a small home by a quiet lake. The place wasn't big or fancy, but it had something that mattered more to him than anything else: space, calm, and water. The lake shimmered under the sun every morning, and at night, it reflected the stars like a mirror. It felt like home the moment he saw it. The first few weeks were perfect. He spent his mornings sipping coffee on the back porch, listening to birds and the gentle splash of fish breaking the surface. He'd smile to himself and think, this is what life should feel like. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving when they passed by, and the streets were clean and quiet. The community was managed by an HOA, but at first he didn't think much of it. They sent a welcome packet, a few rules about landscaping, and a list of upcoming neighborhood meetings. Nothing unusual. One of his biggest joys was his small boat, a project he had started years ago. It wasn't a fancy speedboat or anything expensive. It was a simple wooden boat that he had slowly restored by hand. Every board, every coat of varnish carried his effort and pride. On weekends, he'd take it down to the lake, push it into the water, and drift quietly under the sky. He didn't bother anyone. He didn't make noise. He just wanted peace. At first, nobody said a thing. A few kids waved at him from the shore. A couple walking their dog smiled as he floated by. Everything seemed fine, until one morning he noticed a white envelope taped to his front door. It had the HOA logo printed in bold letters. He opened it casually, thinking it might be a reminder about a community event. But his smile faded as he read the first line. Unauthorized watercraft use is strictly prohibited on the community lake. Please remove your boat immediately to avoid further action. He frowned, reading it again. Unauthorized watercraft? That didn't make sense. His property touched the lake. He wasn't using anyone else's space. Confused, he walked down to the water and looked around. There were no signs saying he couldn't use it. He had even checked before moving in. The lake had always been open for residents. That afternoon, he decided to attend the next HOA meeting. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. When he arrived, the board members were already sitting around a long table flipping through papers. The president, a sharp-tongued woman who seemed to enjoy authority a bit too much, looked up as he spoke. Hi, I got a letter about my boat, he said politely. I just wanted to check if there's been some kind of mistake. The woman crossed her arms and gave him a stiff smile. No mistake. The HOA has decided that private boats are not allowed on the lake. It's for everyone's safety and to maintain the community's image. He blinked. But the lake is right behind my property. I'm not bothering anyone, she shrugged. Rules are rules. The lake is managed by the HOA and no one is exempt. He tried to explain calmly that he was careful, that the boat was small, and that he didn't disturb anyone, but every word bounced off their cold expressions. The president's tone grew sharper. If you don't comply, you'll receive fines, she said. And if the issue continues, we'll take legal steps. He left that meeting frustrated but still polite. He didn't like arguing. He had moved here for peace, not conflict. But something about the situation didn't sit right with him. The HOA talked as if they owned the lake, but did they? He remembered the property documents he had signed when buying the house. There was no mention of the lake being HOA property. It made him wonder. Over the next few days, he continued his routine quietly. He didn't take the boat out again, just to avoid escalating things. But then came another letter, this one more aggressive. Failure to comply will result in daily fines. They even attached photos of his boat as if it were a crime scene. It felt unnecessary, even cruel. The next morning, as he sat by the lake drinking coffee, he watched the sunlight ripple across the water. He could see ducks gliding peacefully, unaware of all the paperwork and rules people created. It was his favorite part of living there, the simplicity. And now it was being taken away by people who didn't even appreciate it. That's when he decided he wouldn't let this go so easily. He wasn't going to argue or yell. That wasn't his way. But he would find out the truth. He started by visiting the county records office. The clerks there were friendly and curious when he told them he wanted to see the property boundaries for the lake. After a few minutes of searching, one of them handed him an old file. That's interesting, she said, tilting her head. The HOA isn't listed as the owner. It's actually registered under an old private company. He looked at her, surprised. So the HOA doesn't own it? She shook her head. Not according to this. Looks like the ownership was never transferred. The company's inactive now. He thanked her and left with copies of the records. As he drove home, his mind was buzzing. The HOA had been acting like they controlled the lake, but they didn't. It wasn't even theirs. That night, he spread the papers across his kitchen table. It was all there in black and white. The company that owned the lake had gone out of business years ago, which meant the property was likely still up for claim. He smiled quietly to himself. The thought was wild, almost unbelievable, but also possible. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of excitement. Maybe he couldn't change how people behaved, but he could control how he responded. He didn't tell anyone what he had found. The HOA continued to send letters confident in their authority, but he had a plan forming, a patient, careful plan that would change everything. He spent the next few evenings by the lake, the old boat tied gently to the dock. The air was cool, the sky deep orange from the sunset. He looked out over the water and thought about how some people loved power, while others just wanted peace. He was one of the latter, but sometimes peace required standing up for what's right, even if it meant doing something bold. The sound of crickets filled the air as he whispered to himself, "If they want control that bad, maybe I should give it to them, just not in the way they expect." He smiled faintly, already picturing how the story might turn out. What the HOA didn't know was that their little game had just begun. The next few weeks were tense. He tried to keep to himself, but the HOA didn't make it easy. Every few days, a new letter would appear in his mailbox. One said he was being fined for non-compliance. Another claimed his boat was an eyesore. Then came one warning that if he didn't remove it immediately, they would pursue legal action. Each letter sounded colder than the last. He didn't even bother getting angry anymore. He had learned that arguing with people who crave control never gets you anywhere. Instead, he stayed calm, quietly working on his plan in the background. He spent evenings at his kitchen table, going over property maps, county documents, and ownership records. The more he learned, the clearer it became. The HOA had no legal claim over the lake at all. They had simply assumed control years ago, and no one had ever questioned it. One afternoon, he visited a local lawyer. The office was small, tucked behind a hardware store, with the kind of lawyer who preferred doing real work over showing off expensive furniture. He laid out the papers and explained the situation. The lawyer took his time reading everything, then looked up with raised eyebrows. "Well," the lawyer said, "you're right. The HOA doesn't own the lake. The property belongs to a dissolved corporation. That means the lake is essentially unclaimed. So," he asked slowly, "can someone buy it?" The lawyer smiled. "Technically, yes, but it might take a bit of work. You'd have to find out if the corporation still has any legal representatives or if the land can be transferred through abandonment procedures. But if it's available, you could own it." He sat back in the chair, processing what that meant. The same people trying to fine him for using the lake could end up needing his permission to even walk near it. He didn't want revenge, but something about the idea felt poetic, the calm kind of justice that didn't need shouting or anger. The lawyer agreed to help him with the paperwork, and together they began the process quietly. Meanwhile, the HOA had no idea what was happening. They were too busy sending threats. The HOA president even sent a notice to his neighbors, warning them not to engage in unauthorized activities involving the lake. Some neighbors avoided him after that, afraid of getting fined. Others whispered behind closed doors, unsure of what was really going on. He didn't let it bother him. Instead, he spent his time making sure every step of the ownership transfer was handled perfectly. He double-checked the tax records, paid all necessary fees, and kept everything legal. It took patience, but he had plenty of that. One morning, as he was leaving for work, he saw a couple of HOA board members standing near the lake, pointing toward his boat. He could tell by their posture that they were complaining. He walked over calmly. "Something wrong?" he asked politely. One of them gave a tight smile. "We're just doing an inspection. The HOA has received several complaints about your property." He looked out at his boat, then back at them. "Complaints? About that?" "Yes," the other said sharply. "It violates community guidelines. It's against the rules," he smiled faintly. "Interesting. Can I see where it says that in the deed or property agreement?" They exchanged glances, not expecting that question. It's part of the HOA policy, one finally said. He nodded slowly. Right, I'll make sure to look into that. Then he turned and walked away before they could say another word. They didn't know it, but he already had something far stronger than a policy. He was weeks away from owning the lake itself. As the paperwork moved forward, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and disbelief. It wasn't every day someone bought a lake just to stop a few overzealous neighbors from bullying them. But it wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about fairness. People like the HOA president had forgotten that communities were meant to bring people together, not control them. When the final documents arrived, his hands actually trembled as he opened the envelope. The lawyer had done it. The sale was official. The lake, from the water to the land under it, now legally belonged to him. He stepped outside that evening, the air cool and calm. The sun was setting over his lake, turning the surface gold. He felt a quiet sense of victory, not the loud bragging kind, but the deep satisfaction of knowing he had done something that couldn't be undone by petty rules or arrogance. Over the next few days, he kept the news to himself. He wanted the HOA to hear it the right way, directly from him. The next meeting was only a week away, and he planned to attend. The HOA meeting room was packed that night. The president sat at the front of the table, flipping through her usual stack of complaints. When she saw him walk in, her expression tightened. "Mr." she began, but he raised a hand politely. "I'm here to clear up a misunderstanding," he said calmly. "You've been sending me fines and letters about my boat, but I believe there's been an error regarding lake ownership." Her eyebrows arched. "Error? The HOA has managed the lake for over 10 years. There's no error." He reached into his folder and placed a few documents on the table. "Actually," he said, keeping his tone even, "there is. As of last week, I own the lake. Here's the deed." The room fell silent. For a long moment, no one moved. The president leaned forward, scanning the papers with disbelief. Her voice cracked slightly when she spoke. This can't be right." "It's right," he said quietly. "I checked everything. The HOA never owned the lake. You've just been maintaining it without legal authority. I filed all the paperwork with the county. It's done." Someone in the back let out a low whistle. The president's face turned pale. She tried to speak again, but he continued calmly. "I don't want trouble. I don't want to make this harder for anyone. But from now on, the HOA no longer has jurisdiction over the lake. If anyone wants to fish, swim, or use a boat, they can do it with my permission. Not yours." He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The silence in the room said enough. The same people who once sent him warnings were now sitting there speechless, realizing the tables had completely turned. He gathered his papers, thanked the room, and walked out with a quiet smile. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, and for the first time in months he felt completely free. The HOA had tried to control him, but now he controlled them. And he hadn't broken a single rule to do it. As he walked back home by the water, he saw the reflection of the moon rippling on the surface. It looked different now, not just peaceful, but powerful. The lake was his, and soon, the entire neighborhood would understand what that really meant. After that night's meeting, word spread through the neighborhood faster than he expected. People whispered about what had happened. Some thought it was a rumor. Others said it couldn't possibly be true. But by the end of the week, everyone knew one thing for sure. The lake no longer belonged to the HOA. It now belonged to him. At first, the neighborhood was quiet. The HOA board didn't say much. They probably hoped the whole thing would blow over. But it didn't. Residents started asking questions. People wanted to know why the HOA had been collecting fees for something they never owned. They wanted answers about where all the money had gone for lake maintenance over the years. He didn't go around bragging or trying to embarrass anyone. That wasn't his style. He just went about his days as usual. Every morning he'd take a walk by the lake, sip his coffee, and enjoy the peace he'd worked so hard to earn. Only now it meant more. The water felt different. Not because he owned it, but because he had stood up for himself in a quiet, powerful way. Still, it didn't take long for the HOA to start pushing back. They called an emergency board meeting and sent a letter to every homeowner. The letter claimed they were reviewing the legality of the lake's ownership transfer and urged residents not to engage in any activities there until the matter was resolved. It was their way of trying to save face. He received a copy of the letter, too. He read it once, smiled, and set it down on his kitchen counter. He wasn't worried. He knew his paperwork was solid. Everything had been done legally and properly. The HOA could review it all they wanted. It wouldn't change the truth. One evening, as he was sitting on his porch, a neighbor walked over hesitantly. The man looked nervous but curious. "Hey," the neighbor said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Is it true?" "About the lake?" He nodded. "Yeah, it's true." The neighbor's eyes widened. "You really bought it? The whole thing?" "I did," he said calmly. "It was easier than you'd think. The HOA never owned it in the first place." The neighbor let out a low whistle. "Wow. I always thought they were being too strict. They fined me once for leaving my garbage bin out an hour late." He smiled gently. "You're not the only one." Soon word spread even faster. Neighbors started approaching him more often, not to gossip but to thank him. They said it felt like someone had finally stood up to the HOA's bullying. Some of them even offered to help clean up the lake area, now that it wasn't under the HOA's thumb. But while most of the community was happy, the HOA board wasn't. The president started sending him letters again, this time accusing him of acting outside the community's best interests. They even tried to claim that he was putting homeowners at risk by changing lake policies without HOA approval. He didn't even bother responding. Instead, he took the time to make sure everything was managed responsibly. He set up basic safety rules for the lake, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. No loud parties, no pollution, and everyone had to keep the area clean. He made sure it was open to all residents free of charge. That's when things really began to shift. People started gathering by the lake on weekends again. Families came with picnic baskets. Kids played by the shore. People brought out small kayaks and fishing poles. For the first time in years, the place felt alive. He'd sit by the water sometimes, watching people enjoy it and feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. This was what it was supposed to be. Not rules and fines, but community and peace. Of course, the HOA couldn't stand seeing that. They started sending warnings to residents, saying anyone who used the lake without HOA authorization would face penalties. But now, most people ignored them. They knew who really owned it. The HOA's power was slipping away, and they could feel it. One afternoon, he was sitting at home when there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, the HOA president was standing there holding a thick folder. Her expression was tight and controlled, but her tone was sharp. "We need to talk," she said. He nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." She walked in and placed the folder on his table. "We've reviewed the documents," she said stiffly. "And while I can see that the transfer appears legitimate, we believe the HOA still has regulatory authority over the lake under community covenants." He raised an eyebrow. "Regulatory authority? Over property you don't own?" She hesitated. "It's complicated." He leaned back in his chair. "No, it's actually very simple. You can't make rules for something that isn't yours." Her jaw tightened. "You're undermining the structure of this community." He met her gaze calmly. "No, I'm reminding people that this community doesn't belong to a handful of people sitting behind a table. It belongs to everyone who lives here." For a moment, she didn't respond. Her expression softened slightly, almost as if she realized how far things had gone, but pride wouldn't let her admit it. She gathered her papers and stood up. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, and left without another word. He watched her walk down the path, her shoulders stiff. He didn't feel anger or triumph, just relief. He had no interest in fighting anyone. All he wanted was fairness and peace. Over the next few weeks, things in the neighborhood began to change. The HOA's influence started to fade. Fewer people attended their meetings. Some board members even resigned quietly. Tired of the drama, residents began organizing their own community cleanup days, helping each other without waiting for approval. It was strange how something as simple as a small lake could change everything. It reminded everyone what real community looked like. People helping each other because they wanted to, not because they were told to. One evening, he took his boat out again for the first time in months. The air was warm, and the sky was painted with streaks of pink and orange. As he drifted across the calm water, he could hear laughter from families on the shore. It felt peaceful again, like the dream he had when he first moved here. He thought back to all the letters, the threats, the meetings. All the frustration had led to this moment. Quiet, simple happiness. He smiled, thinking how sometimes life's best victories didn't come from fighting harder, but from thinking smarter and staying calm. As the sun dipped below the trees, he looked toward the houses on the hill. He knew not everyone would be happy about how things turned out, but he also knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He had simply refused to be bullied by people who mistook control for leadership. The lake rippled gently beneath the boat as he leaned back and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right again. The water was his, yes, but more than that, it now belonged to a community that finally understood what freedom really meant. He didn't buy the lake to prove a point. He did it to protect the peace he loved, and in doing so, he gave that peace back to everyone who lived around it. That night, as he walked home with the last bit of sunlight fading behind him, he felt something deeper than victory. He felt contentment, the kind that comes when you stand your ground, stay true to your values, and quietly change everything around you. The weeks that followed were quiet at first, but it was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like something was brewing underneath. He could tell the HOA wasn't done with him. They had lost control of the lake, but people who loved power rarely gave it up without a fight. Still, he didn't waste time worrying. He was focused on keeping the lake clean and open for everyone. On weekends, he'd see families fishing, kids paddling small inflatable rafts, and older neighbors sitting on the benches, chatting as the sun went down. It felt good to see life return to the lake. The air was lighter now, filled with laughter instead of tension. But behind the scenes, the HOA was busy plotting its next move. They called another emergency meeting, claiming they were discussing community safety. Of course, everyone knew it was really about him and the lake. Some neighbors told him they were trying to find a loophole that could give them back control. Others said the board was looking for ways to file complaints with local authorities. He didn't attend that meeting. He didn't need to. He had already done everything by the book. Every document was solid, every signature in place. The HOA could dig all they wanted. They'd only find their own mistakes. One morning, he received a new letter from them. It was thick and printed on fancy paper, almost as if they thought the extra weight would make it more important. The letter claimed he had violated community environmental rules by encouraging unauthorized lake usage. It ended with a warning that further action might be taken if he didn't stop. He read it once, chuckled softly, and placed it neatly in a drawer with the rest of their letters. That drawer had become a kind of collection, a reminder of how far he'd come and how much nonsense he had overcome. Later that day, one of his neighbors stopped by. She was carrying a basket of muffins, smiling shyly. "A little thank you," she said, "for everything you've done. My kids love playing by the lake now. It's the happiest they've been in years." He thanked her, genuinely touched. It wasn't about recognition for him, but it felt nice to know people appreciated it. For so long, the HOA had made people afraid to step out of line, afraid to enjoy their own neighborhood. Now, that fear was fading, replaced by something better: trust. As days turned into weeks, more people began speaking up. Homeowners started questioning the HOA's decisions. Why were they paying fees for things that didn't exist? Why did a handful of people get to decide what everyone else could or couldn't do? The board members started getting defensive. Meetings grew tense. The president, once confident and sharp-tongued, now avoided confrontation whenever possible. One afternoon, he got a call from a local reporter who had heard about the situation. She asked if he'd be willing to share his story. At first, he said no. He wasn't looking for attention. But after some thought, he realized that maybe sharing it could help others who were facing similar problems. So he agreed. The reporter met him by the lake. She was friendly and curious, asking about how it all started: the boat, the letters, the research, and finally the purchase. He answered simply, without drama. "I didn't buy the lake to prove a point," he said. "I bought it because people were trying to take away something peaceful. I just wanted to protect it." When the story came out, it spread quickly online. People all over the country read about the man who had bought an entire lake to stop an overreaching HOA. Most readers found it inspiring. Some couldn't believe it was real, but everyone loved the message, that calm persistence could win over arrogance. Of course, the HOA hated the attention. The president called a special meeting to address the negative publicity. She accused him of embarrassing the community, but by now most homeowners were on his side. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. The lake was cleaner, happier, and freer than it had ever been under the HOA's control. At that meeting, several residents stood up and spoke against the board. One man said, "We moved here for peace, not for rules about what color our curtains should be." Another woman said, "You fined me for having a flower pot that didn't match the others. Maybe it's time you stop worrying about control and start listening to people." By the end of the meeting, it was clear. The HOA's power was slipping fast. A few board members even resigned that night, saying they were tired of all the arguing. The president looked furious but helpless. Meanwhile, he stayed out of the drama. He focused on keeping the lake safe and fair for everyone. He started organizing small community events, cleanup days, fishing mornings, and even a little lake picnic, where everyone could bring food and share stories. It wasn't fancy, but it brought people together. For the first time in a long time, neighbors who had barely spoken were laughing side by side. During one of these events, a few of the kids made a little wooden sign that said, "Welcome to Freedom Lake." The name stuck. People began calling it that naturally, as if it had always been meant to be. He smiled every time he heard it. But even as the community grew closer, the HOA president couldn't let go. One evening, she came to the lake and stood near the water, watching the families and kids play. He noticed her and walked over. She looked tired, like someone who had been fighting too many battles for too long. "You've really changed this place," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. He nodded. "Not just me. Everyone helped," she sighed, shaking her head. "It used to be simple. We had rules, order. People respected the board. Now no one listens." He smiled kindly. "Maybe they're not supposed to listen. Maybe they're supposed to live." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she looked at the water and whispered, "I suppose you're right." He didn't gloat or tease. He just stood beside her, watching the lake shimmer under the fading sunlight. Sometimes peace came not from winning, but from letting go. After that evening, the HOA became quieter. Meetings were fewer. Letters stopped coming. The board still existed, but its tone had changed. Instead of demanding, it began suggesting. Instead of ruling, it began listening. It wasn't perfect, no neighborhood ever is, but things were better. People finally felt free. He often sat on his porch in the evenings, listening to the soft sounds of laughter and the gentle hum of crickets. The air always smelled like summer now, fresh and full of possibility. Sometimes he'd take his boat out just as the sky turned orange and gold, the water calm around him. He'd close his eyes and let the breeze touch his face. In those moments, he thought about everything that had happened. He hadn't set out to become some sort of local hero. He just wanted to enjoy the peace he had earned. But life had a funny way of turning small acts of courage into something bigger. The HOA had tried to control him with rules and fear, but in the end, he had shown everyone something more powerful. Quiet strength, patience, and the belief that doing what's right doesn't always require a fight. Sometimes it just requires not giving up. After that meeting, the entire neighborhood seemed to shift. Word spread fast, faster than he ever imagined. People who used to ignore him suddenly started waving when he passed by. Some even came to his door curious, asking if it was true that he had actually bought the lake. He didn't brag or make a big deal out of it. He just smiled and said, "Yeah, it's mine now, but it's for everyone to enjoy without all the drama." The news hit the HOA board like a thunderstorm. They held emergency meetings trying to figure out how to respond, but there wasn't much they could do. The documents were real. The ownership was legal. The lake no longer fell under their control, and they knew it. For years, they had ruled the community like a small kingdom, making people follow endless rules, but now, for the first time, they had lost power. He didn't use his win to humiliate anyone. He could have easily rubbed it in, but that wasn't his style. Instead, he took quiet satisfaction in seeing things change naturally. A few weeks later, he put up a small wooden sign by the lake that said, "Welcome. Be kind, be respectful, enjoy the water." That was it. No long list of rules, no warnings, no threats, just a simple message. Soon people started to come out more often. Families who used to hide inside on weekends brought out kayaks, canoes, and fishing poles. Kids laughed and played near the shore again. It felt like the neighborhood had finally taken a deep breath after years of tension. One afternoon, an elderly couple came by and thanked him. They said they had lived there for over 20 years but had stopped using the lake because of all the restrictions. Now, for the first time in a long while, They were planning a little picnic by the water. That small moment meant more to him than all the paperwork and arguments. It reminded him why he loved the lake in the first place. The HOA board tried to hold on to their control in other ways, but people had started to question everything. If they had lied or exaggerated about owning the lake, what else had they done? Homeowners began reading the rules themselves and finding out they had more rights than they were told. The board's confidence began to crumble, and some members quietly resigned over the next few months. Meanwhile, he took good care of the lake. He arranged for regular cleanups, fixed the small dock, and even built a few benches along the shore so neighbors could sit and watch the sunset. He didn't charge anyone, didn't set up a gate, didn't try to profit from it. He just wanted people to enjoy what was supposed to be theirs all along, a peaceful place to connect with nature. One day, he saw the former HOA president standing by the water, looking embarrassed. She hesitated for a long time before walking over to him. Her voice was quieter than he remembered. She said, "I guess we pushed too hard." He nodded, not with anger, but understanding. "You wanted things perfect," he said softly. "But sometimes control isn't the same as care." She didn't argue. Instead, she thanked him for maintaining the lake and walked away. That was the last time they spoke, but the air between them felt lighter. Summer turned into autumn, and the lake became a symbol of something bigger than a property dispute. It became proof that standing your ground with patience and respect could change things. The man had every reason to be bitter, but he chose peace instead. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would take his boat out to the center of the lake. The water would reflect the orange glow of the setting sun, and the sound of distant laughter from neighbors carried through the air. He'd smile to himself, thinking about how far things had come. He remembered those first days when he received fines and warnings, when he almost gave up. It seemed almost funny now. What once felt like a battle had turned into something beautiful. A reminder that sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, but rebuilding something better. Over time, the lake became a gathering spot. Every weekend, families would set up small barbecues, teens would play music softly near the water, and old friends would sit and talk for hours. The man didn't host these gatherings, but everyone knew he was the reason they were possible. They respected him not out of fear but gratitude. One afternoon, a new family moved into the neighborhood. Their little boy came running to the lake with a fishing rod, and his mother nervously asked if they were allowed to fish there. The man smiled and said, "Of course. Just take care of it, that's all I ask." She thanked him, and the boy's excitement was contagious. Watching them reminded him of why he had fought so hard, to bring that feeling of freedom back. Months later, local newspapers heard about the story. One reporter even called it the calmest revenge in HOA history, but he didn't like the word revenge. He said, it wasn't about payback, it was about peace. That quote ended up being the headline, and people from nearby towns began visiting the lake just to see it for themselves. Even years later, the community still told the story to newcomers, the man who loved his boat so much that he bought the whole lake. But the truth was deeper than that. He didn't buy it just for himself. He did it so everyone could enjoy it freely, without fear of being told they weren't allowed. Whenever someone asked him how he managed to stay calm through it all, he'd say, "Because getting angry doesn't change anything. But doing something smart and kind does." Those simple words became his quiet motto. Eventually, he built a small boathouse by the shore. Not fancy, just a cozy spot where he could keep his tools, some chairs, and his fishing gear. He'd often sit there sipping coffee and watching the sunrise. The reflection on the water always reminded him that peace doesn't just happen. You create it one choice at a time. The HOA never fully recovered from the embarrassment, but the neighborhood did. People started helping each other more, fixing fences together, planting flowers along the lakefront, and organizing small events. It felt like a community again. The man never considered himself a hero, but deep down he knew he had made a difference. By choosing patience over anger and action over argument, he had changed the place for the better. As years passed, the lake stayed beautiful, calm, and open for everyone. The boat that started it all still floated gently near the dock, a quiet symbol of freedom. And every time someone new came to the water and asked who owned it, the neighbors would smile and say, "A man who believed in doing the right thing," and that was enough for him.